On the afternoon of the 22nd of August, 2008, a woman named Sylvie Holt and her 11-year-old son Jasper left a roadside diner outside Amberley, Oklahoma, paid their bill in cash, and walked to their car in the parking lot. 3 witnesses saw them leave the diner. 2 of those witnesses watched Sylvie unlock the car and Jasper climb into the passenger seat and the car pull out of the lot onto State Highway 54 heading west. The 3rd witness, a truck driver named Dale Pickard, who had been eating at the counter and who stepped outside for a cigarette as they were leaving, said he watched their car until it reached the curve in the highway a quarter mile from the diner and disappeared around it. Nobody saw them again. The car, a white 2003 Chevrolet Malibu with a cracked right tail light and an Oklahoma plate, was found 16 days later in a ravine off a county road 12 miles west of where Dale Pickard had watched it round the curve. The ravine was densely vegetated and the car was not visible from the road. It had been found by a teenager on a dirt bike who had gone off the road into the brush and had nearly driven into it. The car had no collision damage consistent with an accident. The ignition was off. The doors were unlocked. The keys were in the cup holder. No blood, no signs of struggle, no Sylvie, no Jasper. Sylvie Holt was 38 years old. She had been a pharmacy technician in Tulsa for 6 years. She had been driving with Jasper from Tulsa to her mother's house in Amarillo, Texas, a trip she had made 4 times before, always on State Highway 54, always stopping at the diner outside Amberley because Jasper liked their pie. The trip was supposed to take 4 hours. Her mother had been waiting with the porch light on from 7 that evening through the whole of the following day before she called the police. The investigation lasted 8 months in its active phase and produced nothing. The car's position in the ravine, 12 miles from where it was last seen and well off the county road, indicated that someone had driven it there and left it, but the forensic examination of the car produced no prints or biological material belonging to anyone other than Sylvie and Jasper. The county road that accessed the ravine had no surveillance coverage of any kind. The 12 miles of State Highway 54 between the diner and the county road turnoff had 2 cameras, both operated by private businesses, and neither had captured the Malibu on the afternoon of the 22nd. 16 years later, in the spring of 2024, a property developer clearing land for a rural residential development 4 miles north of the ravine where the car was found broke ground on a section of his property that had been designated in the original survey as undisturbed scrubland and found beneath a concrete slab that the survey had not noted and that did not appear in any county permit record. A sealed underground space that the developer's foreman described to the Craig County Sheriff's Department as a room. Not a large room, but a room with a door and a lock and a ventilation pipe running to the surface and a drop ceiling constructed from standard residential materials that the foreman recognized immediately from his years in the building trade as materials that someone had taken care in selecting and in installing. A room built for occupation. Built to sustain the people inside it, built with the specific and terrible attentiveness of someone who had thought carefully about what the room would need to function for its intended purpose and had provided it. This is the story of Sylvie Holt and Jasper Holt, a mother and her son who stopped for pie on a highway in Oklahoma in August and drove around a curve and did not arrive where they were going, and a room that someone had built in the scrubland of Craig County before they arrived, waiting with its ventilation pipe and its locked door for what the highway would eventually provide. Subscribe now. Because this road trip did not end at the curve. It ended somewhere that took 16 years to find. Craig County, Oklahoma. Population 14,300. Organized across a geography of flat red dirt ranch land and the green interruptions of the Grand Lake of the Cherokees waterway system in the county's eastern section and the drier, sparser upland scrub of its western reaches, where the land flattened into the high plains approach that connected Oklahoma's eastern hill country to the Texas panhandle in the long, unobstructed perspective of a geography that had no interest in concealment and that offered, across its open distances, a visibility in every direction that made the idea of anything hidden within it seem almost contradictory. Almost. State Highway 54 ran diagonally across the county's southern section in the northwest to southeast orientation of a road that had been built to connect 2 points by the most direct route available rather than the most scenic or the most inhabited. It passed through Amberley, a town of 3,000 that existed at the highway's intersection with the county road network, and continued west into the scrubland approach to the Texas border without passing through any community of comparable size for the remaining 22 miles of its county traversal. There were no towns in those 22 miles. There were ranches set back from the highway on private roads and occasional agricultural structures visible from the road at distances that made detail impossible, and the highway itself moving through the scrubland in the straight and purposeful way of a road that knew where it was going and had nothing to say about the territory it was passing through. Sylvie Holt had driven that stretch of highway 4 times before the 5th time, each time in the same direction, west toward her mother's house in Amarillo, and had found in the repetition of the route the particular comfort of a familiar journey, the comfort of knowing what was coming and when, and of being able to give Jasper accurate information when he asked how much further. Because 11-year-old boys asked how much further with a regularity that the familiarity of the route made answerable with the confidence of someone who had measured the journey in its component parts and knew each of them. She had known the diner outside Amberley since the first trip, had discovered it with Jasper on the drive when she had pulled off for gas, and Jasper had seen the sign for pie in the diner's window and had deployed the full negotiating capacity of an 11-year-old's enthusiasm and had won the negotiation in the way that 11-year-olds whose parents loved them tended to win negotiations about pie. She had become, across the 4 subsequent trips, a regular in the way that highway diners defined regulars, which was a face that the staff recognized and whose order was remembered in broad outline, even if not in specific detail. The counter waitress, a woman named Bev Coulter, who had worked the diner for 11 years and who had given her statement to the Craig County Sheriff's Department within hours of Sylvie being reported missing, said she had known Sylvie and Jasper's order before they sat down. 2 coffees, 1 decaf, and the cherry pie for the boy. The cherry pie for the boy. Bev Coulter had said this to the investigating detective and had then been unable to continue speaking for a moment and had looked out the diner window at the parking lot where Sylvie's car had been and had composed herself and had continued because the cherry pie for the boy was the detail that made the thing real in the way that specific small details made large, terrible things real. The ordering of a familiar dessert in the ordinary course of a familiar journey, carrying all of the weight of what ordinary things carried when they turned out to be the last of themselves. The concrete slab that the developer's foreman had found in the spring of 2024 was located on a parcel that had been purchased in 2006, 2 years before Sylvie and Jasper's disappearance, by a private buyer whose documentation was in order and whose name appeared in the Craig County property records without generating any particular attention because the purchase of rural scrubland parcels in Craig County was not an event that generated particular attention, it being the kind of transaction that the county's property market processed with the regularity of a market organized around the availability of affordable rural land and the periodic desire of individuals to own some. The name on the deed was Harlan Creed. Mara Seaton had been writing about missing persons cases for a decade and had developed, across those 10 years, the particular investigative instinct that was not intuition in the mystical sense, but was the accumulated pattern recognition of a person who had read enough case files and visited enough crime scenes and spoken with enough families to understand the difference between the cases that felt finished and the cases that felt interrupted, the cases that had reached a conclusion that the evidence supported, and the cases that were paused at a point where the conclusion was present somewhere in the record but had not yet been found. The Sylvie and Jasper Holt case had always felt interrupted to her. She had encountered it 5 years into her work when she was building the internal database of unsolved cases that she maintained and updated as the primary organizational tool of her investigative attention. A database of over 400 cases organized by state and year and type, and the specific quality of the available evidence. And the Holt case had been flagged in her database under a notation she used for cases in which the physical evidence of the vehicle placement indicated the involvement of a third party with local geographic knowledge, but in which that third party had not been identified. The vehicle in the ravine 12 miles from the last confirmed sighting. 12 miles was not a random distance. It was the distance a person could cover in the time available between the last sighting and the earliest possible point at which an absence would be noted, which was not until Sylvie's mother had waited through the evening and the night and into the following day before calling the police. The ravine was not a random location. It was a location that required knowledge of a county road that was not on any standard navigation map of the period, and that was not signposted from the highway, a road that someone who had not grown up in the county or spent considerable time in it would not know existed. The person who had driven the Malibu to the ravine had known the county, had known it well enough to move through it in the time available and to choose a concealment location that had been sufficient for 16 days and had only been found by accident. She had been in Tulsa working on an unrelated case when the item about the concrete slab appeared in the Craig County Daily Record's online edition, a brief item of 4 paragraphs that confirmed a discovery on rural property north of the highway and stated that the Craig County Sheriff's Department was investigating in connection with a cold case from 2008. The item did not name the case. The item did not need to. There was only one cold case from Craig County in 2008 that the discovery of an underground room with a ventilation pipe could be connected to, and she had been waiting, without being able to say precisely that she was waiting, for something like this for 5 years. She drove from Tulsa to Amberley in 2 hours and 40 minutes on a Thursday morning in April, State Highway 54, carrying her west through the flat, red dirt landscape in the way it carried everything along its diagonal, purposefully and without scenic consideration. She passed the diner outside Amberley without stopping, noting it and its parking lot and the section of highway visible from the lot and the curve a quarter-mile west where Dale Pickard had watched the white Malibu disappear, and she continued west on the highway for 12 miles until she found the county road on the right side and turned onto it and drove south until she found the developer's vehicles and the Craig County Sheriff's Department cruisers at the edge of a cleared section of red dirt scrubland. The developer, a man named Lester Prine, whose company operated out of Claremore and who had been developing rural residential parcels in Craig County for 8 years, met her at the perimeter with the helpful agitation of a man who had found something he had not expected and who was managing the gap between those two things with the instinct of a person accustomed to managing complications in the practical manner of someone for whom complications were a feature of every project and who defaulted to cooperative efficiency as the fastest route through them. He told her what his foreman had found and where and how the discovery had been reported and what the sheriff's department had done since arriving. She asked him about the concrete slab. He said it was a poured slab approximately 8 feet by 10, lying flush with the surrounding ground and covered by a layer of compacted red dirt and scrub vegetation that had grown over it in the way vegetation grew over an impervious surface, thin at the edges and thinner at the center and entirely sufficient, from the survey perspective of a drone or a satellite or a person walking the land, to render the slab invisible as a slab and visible only as a slightly different quality of ground, the distinction between compacted dirt over concrete and compacted dirt over earth being a distinction that required either specific knowledge of what was there or the disruption of the surface to reveal it. The survey, he said, had not caught it because the survey had been conducted by drone at a resolution that the vegetation cover had been sufficient to defeat. His foreman had caught it because the clearing equipment had broken through the vegetation layer and encountered the concrete below the blade, and the foreman had stopped the equipment and had looked at what was there and had understood, from the ventilation pipe that was visible at the edge of the slab's exposed section, that the slab was covering something that had been built to be lived in. The ventilation pipe was a 4-inch PVC pipe, standard residential construction material, that emerged from the concrete approximately 18 inches from the slab's eastern edge and terminated at a height of 3 inches above the ground surface, the termination point fitted with a mesh cap of the type used to prevent animal ingress into enclosed spaces while permitting air exchange. The pipe's height above the ground was the minimum necessary for function, low enough that the scrub vegetation had grown around and partially over the mesh cap without being obstructed by it. a design decision that spoke to the same attentiveness that had produced a slab flush with the surrounding ground and a vegetation layer indistinguishable from undisturbed scrub. Mara photographed the ventilation pipe before the Craig County Sheriff's Department detective on scene, a woman named Sergeant Adele Vance, who had been assigned the case that morning and who was calibrated and watchful in the way of someone new to a scene who is still building her understanding of it, indicated that the forensic team was about to begin access work on the slab's entry mechanism, and that photographs taken during access work would be part of the official record and would be available through the standard public information process after the investigation reached the appropriate stage. Mara stepped back to the perimeter as the forensic team moved in. She watched the access work from a distance of 30 feet, which was close enough to observe the process without interfering with it, and far enough to provide the team with the unobstructed working space that a scene of this type required. She watched the team locate the entry mechanism, which was on the slab's northern edge, a recessed handle of the type used in floor hatches in commercial construction, fitted into the concrete in a way that rendered it flush with the surface and required knowledge of its location to operate. She watched the handle be raised and the hatch be opened, and the interior of the space below be illuminated by the portable lighting that the forensic team deployed before anyone descended. She watched Sergeant Vance descend. She watched Vance in the space below for 4 minutes before Vance ascended and stood at the hatch edge and looked at Mara across the 30 feet of red dirt scrubland with an expression that communicated, without requiring words to communicate it, that what was below the slab was what they had both been thinking it might be since the item in the Craig County Daily Record had appeared that morning. Mara wrote the time in her notebook. 9:47 in the morning. The Oklahoma scrubland around her flat and red and open in every direction, and the ventilation pipe 3 inches above the ground, catching the morning light on its mesh cap, and the hatch standing open beside it, and Sergeant Adele Vance looking at her from the edge of it with the expression of a woman who had just descended into a place that had been built for 2 people and who was still in the first moments of understanding what that meant. The Craig County property records on the parcel north of the highway showed an ownership history that the county assessor's office produced for Sergeant Vance within 2 hours of her request on Thursday morning. The efficiency of the production reflecting the particular civic responsiveness of a rural county office, whose request volume was low enough that an urgent inquiry from the Sheriff's Department received immediate rather than queued attention. The parcel was 14 acres of red dirt scrubland with no recorded improvements, which meant the concrete slab and the underground space beneath it appeared in no permit record and no inspection record and no tax assessment record, because the county's property improvement documentation system documented only improvements that had been permitted and inspected, and the underground space had been neither. It had been built in the way of things built specifically to avoid the documentation that the permitting system would have required, using materials sourced in ways that left no trail to the specific location and constructed with the skilled and patient attention of someone who understood exactly what the documentation system looked for and had organized the construction to present none of those characteristics to anyone looking from the outside. The purchase had been made in 2006 in the name of Harlan Creed, a name that the Craig County records showed as having had a mailing address at a post office box in Miami, Oklahoma, the small city in the county's northeastern corner, and an Oklahoma driver's license number that Vance ran through the department's database within an hour of receiving the property record. The driver's license was valid and had last been renewed in 2005. It showed a photograph of a man who appeared to be in his mid-40s, with the weathered, angular face of someone who had spent considerable time outdoors and whose complexion reflected that time in the particular way of men who worked in the Oklahoma sun across the working years of their lives. Dark hair with significant gray at the temples. A level and unrevealing gaze, the gaze of a person who had calibrated their presentation for a photograph in the way that people calibrated it, neither smiling nor frowning, offering the camera only what the camera required, and nothing that the camera would retain as an expression. The license had not been renewed after 2005, which meant either that Harlan Creed had moved out of Oklahoma and had obtained a license in another state, or that Harlan Creed had modified his documented identity in the period after 2005 and before the 2006 property purchase. using the name for the purchase while the name was still attached to a valid license and then allowing the license to lapse when the name had served the purpose for which it was being maintained. Vance ran the name through every available database with the standard completeness that a missing persons investigation of this seniority required. The results confirmed the driver's license and the property purchase and a vehicle registration from 2003 for a pickup truck, dark green, Craig County registration. The truck registration had not been renewed after 2006. No other records, no criminal history, no tax filings under the name in Oklahoma or in any adjacent state after 2005. No death certificate in any state whose records were accessible through the interstate database. The pattern that the Craig County database produced in 4 minutes was the same pattern that investigators in other states had found in other investigations: the thin and deliberately minimal record of a name maintained for a specific purpose across a specific period, and then shed when the purpose had been served. The identity modification methodology of someone who had learned to manage the documentary infrastructure of a life in such a way that the shedding left nothing to follow. Nothing except, in this case, 14 acres of red dirt scrubland with a concrete slab poured flush to the surface and a ventilation pipe 3 inches above the ground, and a room below the slab that the forensic team was in the process of documenting with the methodical care that the site required, and that Vance was coordinating from the surface while Mara Seaton stood at the perimeter and wrote in her notebook and thought about a man who had bought 14 acres of Oklahoma scrubland 2 years before Sylvie and Jasper Holt stopped for cherry pie in Amberley, and had built a room beneath it with a ventilation pipe and a flush concrete hatch and the specific and attentive construction of someone who had been thinking about what the room would need to function before there was anyone to put in it. Mara drove to Amberley in the early afternoon, leaving the site when the forensic documentation was sufficiently advanced that her presence at the perimeter was no longer producing new information, and when the site was entering the phase of systematic process that required time rather than observation. She drove the 12 miles from the county road to the highway and turned east and arrived at the diner in 20 minutes and parked in the lot and sat in her car for a moment, looking at the diner's exterior, the standard roadside architecture of a building whose purpose was legibility from a moving vehicle and whose interior promised the particular comfort of a meal in a fixed and familiar place in the middle of a journey between 2 points. She went inside. The lunch hour was past, and the diner was nearly empty. A man in work clothes was at a table near the window, and an elderly couple was at the counter's far end. The counter waitress, a woman in her 50s who moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been working a counter for a long time, came to where Mara sat and poured coffee, without asking, in the way that counter waitresses who had been doing it for a long time poured coffee without asking. Mara asked whether she knew a waitress named Bev Coulter. The woman behind the counter set the coffee pot down and looked at her with an expression that shifted from the pleasantly professional to the carefully assessing in the way of an expression that recognizes a name that carries weight and is determining how much weight the situation requires her to acknowledge. She said Bev had retired in 2019. She said she had worked alongside Bev for 11 years and that Bev had worked the counter for 22 years before retiring, and that if Mara was asking about Bev, she was probably asking about the Holt case, and that the Holt case was a subject the diner had not stopped carrying since the August of 2008, when the Craig County Sheriff's Department had arrived and had photographed the parking lot, and had interviewed everyone on shift, and had left, and had come back twice more in the following months, and had eventually stopped coming. Mara said yes. She said she was writing about the Holt case, and that something had been found that morning that was going to reopen it, and that she was trying to understand the geography of the disappearance before the investigation became public, and the geography became the background of a news cycle, rather than the subject of careful attention. The waitress, whose name was Greta, and who had been working the Amberley Diner since 2008, which was the same year as the disappearance, and which she noted was not a coincidence in the sense of timing, but simply the year she had started, and which had therefore given the Holt case a peculiar permanence in her understanding of her time at this counter, the case present from her first month, and still present in the way that things were present when they were never resolved, poured herself a coffee and leaned against the counter and said she would tell Mara what she knew. She said she had not waited on Sylvie and Jasper on the day they disappeared because she had been on the morning shift and had finished at 2, and they had come in, according to Bev, at 3:30. But she had worked the shift after Bev on many days across the 11 years they had overlapped and had heard Bev describe the Holts across those years with the particular clarity of a memory that was kept alive by the knowledge of what it had become. Bev returning to the details of the last visit the way people returned to the last conversation they had with someone they would not see again, turning the details over to check whether any of them looked different from a different angle. She said Bev had been specific about one detail that had not appeared in the case coverage as far as Greta knew, and that Bev had mentioned on more than one occasion across the years as a detail she had not been asked about in the right way by the investigating officers, which was not a criticism of the investigating officers, but was an observation about the difference between being asked a question that your answer fits and being asked a question that your answer exceeds. Mara asked her what the detail was. Greta said Bev had described a man at the counter on the afternoon of August 22nd, a man she had not seen before. He had been at the far end of the counter when Sylvie and Jasper arrived and had remained at the counter while they ate their pie and drank their coffee and paid their bill. He had not appeared to be paying attention to them in any overt way. He had been drinking coffee and reading a newspaper, the specific occupation of a counter regular whose presence communicated settled familiarity with the space. But Bev had noticed that when Sylvie and Jasper rose to leave, the man had looked up from his newspaper and had watched them walk to the door. Not unusually, not in a way that would have been alarming to observe in the moment. The look of a person noticing movement in a peripheral field, rather than the directed attention of someone tracking a specific person. But Bev had seen it and had noted it internally in the way that experienced counterworkers noted things. The comprehensive ambient awareness of a person who spent their working hours reading a room and who registered what the room contained even when they were occupied with something else. The man had paid his bill and left approximately 4 minutes after Sylvie and Jasper. He had paid in cash. He had not been a regular and had not returned after that day, and Bev had not thought of him again until 3 days later when the Craig County Sheriff's Department arrived and began asking questions, and she had mentioned the man and had been asked to describe him and had described him and had been told that the description would be noted and had not, as far as she knew, been followed up on in any way that produced a result. Mara asked for the description. Greta said mid-40s, Bev had said. Weathered, angular face, dark hair going gray at the temples, work-worn hands, the hands of a man who worked outdoors. She said he had been the kind of man who looked like he belonged in that part of Oklahoma in the way that a certain kind of face belonged to a certain kind of landscape, the face of the land itself rendered in a person, the red dirt openness of Craig County compressed into the features of someone who had spent a long time moving through it. Mara looked at the counter in front of her and thought about the driver's license photograph in the database, the weathered angular face and the dark hair going gray at the temples and the level, unrevealing gaze of a man who had calibrated his presentation to offer only what was required. She thought about a man at a counter reading a newspaper who had watched a mother and her son walk to the door and had paid his bill 4 minutes later and had gone to his dark green pickup truck in the parking lot and had pulled out onto State Highway 54 heading west. She thought about the curve a quarter-mile west of the diner where Dale Pickard had watched the white Malibu disappear. She thought about 14 acres of scrubland 12 miles from that curve, and a room beneath a concrete slab with a ventilation pipe and a locked door, and a drop ceiling constructed with the careful attentiveness of someone who had thought about what the room would need. She left money on the counter and walked to her car and drove west on Highway 54 and did not stop until she reached the curve. She sat in her car at the curve for a long time, looking at the highway ahead of it and the highway behind it, and the flat, red dirt scrubland on both sides going to the horizon in every direction, open and visible and entirely without concealment above the ground. Below it was a different matter. The forensic documentation of the underground space took 2 full days. Sergeant Adele Vance coordinated the process from the surface, descending periodically to observe the team's progress, and ascending to manage the expanding administrative requirements of a case that had been cold for 16 years and that was now generating the kind of institutional momentum that significant physical discoveries generated. The momentum of multiple agencies becoming simultaneously interested in a case that had existed for a decade and a half in the low-visibility territory of a dormant file. The space below the concrete slab was 8 feet by 10, consistent with the slab's exterior dimensions. Its ceiling was the underside of the slab itself, poured smooth and painted with a white latex paint that had been applied with the specific intention of increasing the light-reflective quality of an enclosed underground space whose natural tendency toward darkness the builder had addressed with the same practical attentiveness he had brought to the ventilation pipe and the flush hatch and the vegetation cover. 2 battery-operated light fixtures were mounted to the ceiling, their batteries long dead but their installation intact. The kind of fixtures sold in hardware stores for outbuildings and workshops, sufficient for functional illumination of a space this size without requiring an electrical connection to an external power source. The walls were timber-framed drywall construction, the same drop ceiling standard that the developer's foreman had recognized immediately as residential building material, applied to the interior of an excavated underground space with the finishing quality of someone who had drywalled rooms before, and who had applied the same care to an underground structure that a skilled builder applied to an interior room. The corners taped and mudded, the seams invisible, the surface primed and painted in the same white as the ceiling. The floor was plywood over a vapor barrier over the compacted red clay of the Oklahoma subsoil. The plywood fitted with the precision of someone who had measured the space correctly before cutting, the seams tight and the surface level. Along the eastern wall, a timber-framed shelf unit had been built into the space, anchored to the wall studs with the structural permanence of built-in furniture rather than the temporary quality of freestanding shelving. The shelves held what they had been holding for 16 years, their contents preserved in the sealed and climate-moderated conditions of an underground space in Oklahoma clay that maintained a temperature range substantially narrower than the surface above it, cool in summer and insulated from the winter cold by the Earth's thermal mass in the way of all underground spaces in that geology. The shelf contents were organized in the way of a domestic space, which was the most disturbing quality of them. The organization of a person who had thought about what 2 people would need for an extended period and had provided it with the methodical completeness of someone planning a supply run for a specific and understood duration. Canned goods, the labels long faded but the cans intact. Bottled water in the sealed plastic of commercial bottled water, the bottles collapsed somewhat as the contents had been consumed and the air had slowly infiltrated the seals across years. Paper goods, toilet paper, and paper towels in quantities consistent with extended use. A first aid kit in a green plastic case. 2 paperback books whose covers had gone soft in the humidity of the enclosed space. A deck of playing cards, a flashlight with corroded batteries, a child's handheld electronic game of the type that had been common in 2008, its batteries also corroded and its screen dark. The child's game was the item that the forensic team's lead, a State Bureau specialist named Dr. Clifton Barr, who had been flown in from Oklahoma City on the morning of the discovery and who briefed Vance with the comprehensive precision of someone who understood that the briefing was doing work that the investigation needed done carefully, described as the most communicative single item in the space in terms of establishing the probable identity of the space's intended occupants. It was a game unit of a model that had been popular in the late 2000s and that had been marketed specifically to children in the 8 to 12 age range, and its presence on the shelf alongside the 2 paperback books whose covers, when the forensic team carefully managed the deteriorated paper, revealed titles consistent with adult reading, established the composition of the intended occupancy with the specificity of consumer goods whose demographic targeting was its own form of documentation, a woman and a child. Adult reading material and a child's game. Domestic supplies calculated for 2 people across an extended period. A room built and supplied before the 2 people were in it. Vance relayed the shelf contents to Mara Seaton by phone on Thursday evening after the initial documentation was complete. and the forensic team had begun its biological analysis of the space's surfaces and floor for the trace evidence of human presence. She relayed it in the careful and qualified language that an active investigation required, noting what had been found and what it indicated without stating formally what the indication meant for the Holt case, because the formal statement of what the indication meant was a conclusion that the investigation had not yet reached through the evidentiary process that conclusions required. Mara listened and wrote in the methodical way she wrote when an account was delivering material faster than the pen could organize it into the narrative structure that her journalist's instinct was already building around it. She wrote shelf unit and child's game and adult reading and calculated for 2, and she underlined calculated for 2 because the calculation was the most significant element of what the shelf contents communicated, the pre-planning of a person who had built a room and supplied it before the people it was built for had been placed in it, the preparation of a space that was waiting to receive what the highway would eventually deliver. She asked Vance whether the biological analysis had produced any preliminary indication of prior occupancy. Vance said it was too early for formal findings, but that the preliminary assessment of the forensic team's lead was that the space showed the biological markers of human presence consistent with extended occupancy, the concentration and distribution of biological trace material in the patterns that a space regularly used for living produced, rather than the patterns of a space constructed and then left empty. Mara asked how extended. Vance said Dr. Barre's preliminary estimate, qualified as a preliminary estimate in the way that forensic scientists qualified preliminary estimates, was a period of weeks rather than days and potentially longer, the specific duration requiring the full laboratory analysis to narrow from the preliminary range to the specific range that the evidence could support. Weeks. In a room 8 feet by 10 beneath a concrete slab in the Oklahoma scrubland with a ventilation pipe 3 inches above the ground and a locked door and a shelf with a child's game and 2 paperback books and bottled water and canned goods calculated for 2. Mara set the phone down after the call and looked at her notebook and thought about Sylvie Holt, who had been a pharmacy technician in Tulsa and who had made this drive 4 times before the 5th time, and who had known every mile of it by the quality of her familiarity with it, known the curve a 1/4 mile from the diner and the county road junction 12 miles west and the scrubland that went to the Texas border and all the distances between. She thought about Jasper, who had been 11 and who had liked cherry pie and who had climbed into the passenger seat of the white Malibu in the diner parking lot, and whose handheld game was on a shelf in the dark of a room underground in the scrubland 4 miles north of where the car had been left in the ravine. She thought about the game's corroded batteries and the dark screen and the years between the batteries working and the batteries not working and what the years between contained. She thought about the child's game for a long time before she opened a new page in her notebook and began writing the questions that the shelf contents had assembled, the questions that the investigation would need to answer and that her journalism would need to follow the investigation toward with the patience that following an investigation required, which was a different patience from the patience of building an investigation, but was a patience nonetheless, the patience of someone who understood that the story was not hers to control, but was hers to document with the full attention that it deserved. The first question she wrote was the same question she always wrote at the beginning of the part of a case where the physical evidence had established the what and the where, and the investigation was turning toward the who and the how and the why. She wrote it at the top of the page and underlined it once. Who is Harlan Creed? The State Bureau of Investigation assigned lead jurisdiction to Special Agent Doran Lusk on the Friday morning after the discovery, 48 hours into the active investigation and at the point where the forensic documentation of the underground space had produced sufficient preliminary findings to establish that the case required the investigative resource and the cross-jurisdictional capacity that a state-level agency could provide, and that the Craig County Sheriff's Department, with the goodwill and competence of Sergeant Vance and a staff of 11 deputies, could not sustain across the scale the case was revealing. Lusk was 47 years old and had spent 19 years with the State Bureau, the last 7 in the Violent Crimes Division, where he had developed a specific expertise in cases involving the planned and premeditated confinement of victims, cases that required a different investigative approach than the reactive investigation of impulsive crimes because the planning itself was the primary evidence, the deliberate and patient preparation of a person who had thought carefully about what they were doing and whose thinking was therefore embedded in every physical element of the crime scene in a way that an impulsive crimes scene was not. He read the preliminary forensic report on the drive from Oklahoma City to Craig County with his junior investigator, a methodical woman named Preska Dahl, at the wheel, and the flat Oklahoma highway unreeling before them in the morning light and the red dirt landscape on both sides going past with the steady indifference of a landscape that had seen a great deal of human passage and had organized no opinion about any of it. He made 11 notes in the preliminary report's margins by the time they reached the site. The first note said, construction date. The second said, materials sourcing. The third said, ventilation pipe height deliberate, minimum viable above ground. The fourth said, supplies pre-positioned, duration calculation. The fifth said, child-specific item, pre-knowledge of target. He underlined child-specific item, pre-knowledge of target twice, and sat with it for a moment before writing the sixth note, which said, Harlan Creed, identity modification pattern, find the original name. Finding the original name was the investigative priority he had established before arriving at the site, because the name Harlan Creed was the end of a chain rather than the beginning of one, and following the chain backward through its modifications was the process by which the person at the beginning of it would be located. The chain's first link was the driver's license, which was the earliest Harlan Creed documentation that the database had produced and which predated the property purchase by a year and the vehicle registration by 3 years, placing the creation of the Harlan Creed identity at approximately 2002, 6 years before Sylvie and Jasper Holt stopped for cherry pie. He submitted the driver's license photograph to the State Bureau's facial recognition unit on Friday morning before he reached the site, with a request for comparison against criminal history databases, missing persons records, and the identity verification records that the Bureau maintained from previous investigations involving documented identity modifications. The facial recognition request was a standard investigative tool whose utility he had found, across 7 years of violent crimes work, to be neither the miraculous instrument that popular understanding of it suggested, nor the ineffective one that its critics described, but a genuinely useful component of an investigative process that still required the human judgment of an experienced investigator to direct it toward productive results and interpret those results with the appropriate level of certainty. The site visit on Friday morning confirmed the forensic team's preliminary documentation and produced for Lusk the direct experience of the underground space that reading about it and reviewing photographs of it had not fully provided. The physical sensation of descending 6 steps through a hatch in a concrete slab in the Oklahoma scrubland and standing in a room that had been built for 2 people and that had held 2 people and that communicated, in the combination of its domestic provision and its structural security, the full and terrible clarity of its intended function. He stood in the space for 5 minutes without moving or speaking, which was his practice in enclosed crime scenes because enclosed spaces communicated things to the body before they communicated them to the analytical mind, and the body's communication deserved the time to be received before the analytical mind organized it into the language of an investigation. He looked at the shelf unit and its contents, the corroded batteries and the faded labels and the soft-covered paperbacks and the child's game. He looked at the door, which was a standard interior residential door fitted with a commercial-grade deadbolt and a surface-mounted hasp and padlock bracket on the exterior side. The deadbolt operable from both sides with a key that the forensic team had not found, and the padlock bracket operable only from the exterior, the combination of mechanisms providing for a door that could be locked from outside in a way that prevented opening from inside, regardless of whether the deadbolt was engaged. He looked at the padlock bracket for a long time. A person inside the room could operate the deadbolt. A person outside the room could operate the padlock. The padlock made the deadbolt irrelevant from the perspective of exit. This was a design decision made by someone who had thought about the mechanisms of the door with the specific attention of someone designing a space for long-term containment rather than for the temporary confinement of a person who might be expected to leave through the door at some point. He ascended from the space and stood at the hatch edge in the Friday morning Oklahoma sunlight and breathed the open air of the scrubland, which was dry and warm and carried the particular quality of spring air in Oklahoma's red dirt country, a quality that was the opposite in every sensory dimension of the quality of the air in the space below. And he thought about what it meant to design a room for 2 people and supply it across a calculated duration and build a lock into its door that the people inside could not operate, and then cover the room with a concrete slab flush to the ground and grow vegetation over the slab and leave the room with its ventilation pipe and its locked door waiting for what the highway would provide. He returned to Oklahoma City on Friday afternoon and was at his desk by the time the facial recognition unit's results arrived at 4:17. The results were structured in the format the unit used for comparison requests, a ranked list of potential matches with confidence scores and database sources noted alongside each entry. The highest confidence match at the top of the list carried a confidence score of 91% and was sourced from a criminal history database entry from the state of Texas. The entry was for an arrest, not a conviction, from the year 1997. The charge associated with the arrest was unlawful restraint, a charge that had been reduced in the subsequent legal process to criminal trespass and had produced a suspended sentence with no incarceration and a fine that the record showed had been paid within 30 days. The name on the Texas criminal history entry was not Harlan Creed. It was Garth Weldon. The arrest had occurred in Lubbock County, Texas, 12 years before the discovery of the underground space in Craig County, Oklahoma. The address listed on the arrest record was a rural route in the Texas Panhandle. Lusk ran Garth Weldon through every available database. The results were more extensive than the Harlan Creed results, which was expected if Garth Weldon was the earlier name and Harlan Creed the modification, the earlier identity having had more time to accumulate the documentary trace of a person who had been living under it before the modification. The Garth Weldon record showed a Texas driver's license issued in 1989 and renewed through 1999, a vehicle registration in Lubbock County through 2001, the arrest record from 97, property tax records for the rural route address through 2001, a social security record showing employment history in the construction trades across the Texas Panhandle and southwestern Oklahoma from the mid-1980s through the late 1990s. Construction trades. Lusk looked at that detail and set it alongside the construction quality of the underground space, the dry-walled walls and the taped and mudded corners, and the vapor barrier and the plywood floor fitted with the precision of someone who had measured the space correctly before cutting. And he thought about a man who had spent 15 years in the construction trades and who had applied that skilled and patient expertise to the building of an underground room in the Oklahoma scrubland with the attentiveness that 15 years in the trades produced in a person whose relationship to building was the relationship of someone who had done it every working day across a professional lifetime. The Garth Weldon record ended in 2001, the same year the property tax records in Texas lapsed. The Harlan Creed record began in 2002, the year after the Garth Weldon records ended. The sequence was consistent with the pattern that Lusk had seen in previous investigations involving identity modifications, the deliberate shedding of a documented name at a point where the previous name had accumulated documentation the person wanted to leave behind, particularly a criminal history entry, however minor, that a background check would surface. He called the Lubbock County Sheriff's Department and asked for the full file on the 1997 unlawful restraint arrest. The file was emailed to him within an hour, a courtesy that reflected both the departmental efficiency of the Lubbock County office and the specific urgency that Lusk's request had communicated, which was the urgency of an ongoing investigation rather than the retrospective interest of an agency reviewing old records for academic purposes. The file confirmed the arrest details and added 3 things the database entry had not contained. The name of the arresting officer, a deputy named Russ Moyer, who the file showed, had retired from the department in 2015. The name of the victim in the unlawful restraint charge, a woman whose name Lusk noted and immediately submitted to the National Missing Persons Database cross-reference, and a physical description of Garth Weldon at the time of the arrest that matched the driver's license photograph of Harlan Creed with the correlation of the same person photographed 7 years apart. the same angular weathered face and the same dark hair, now more substantially gray, the same level, unrevealing gaze. The cross-reference result on the victim's name came back in 22 minutes. The name appeared in a missing persons report filed with the Lubbock County Sheriff's Department in the year 2000, 3 years after the arrest. The report had been filed by a family member who had lost contact with the woman after a period of irregular communication that the report described as consistent with the woman's established pattern of periodic withdrawal from contact, but that the family member had concluded, after a duration that exceeded the established pattern, required formal reporting. The case had been reviewed once in 2003 and had been classified as a voluntary disappearance based on the woman's history of periodic contact withdrawal and the absence of any physical evidence suggesting otherwise. The classification had not been formally revisited. Lusk looked at the classification and looked at the arrest from 3 years before the disappearance, and looked at the charge of unlawful restraint that had been reduced to criminal trespass and had produced a suspended sentence, and looked at the construction quality of the underground space in the Oklahoma scrubland, and the padlock bracket on the exterior of the door, and the shelf with its domestic supplies calculated for 2, and the child's game with its corroded batteries on the second shelf from the top. He called Sergeant Vance in Craig County and told her what the facial recognition had produced. He said the investigation now had 2 names for the same person and potentially a prior victim whose case had been misclassified and would need to be formally reopened. He said he needed her to locate the retired Deputy Russ Moyer and to ask him what he remembered about the 1997 arrest that the file contained and whether there had been elements of the situation that the file did not fully capture. He said he was going to make a call to Mara Seaton. Vance asked him why he was going to call the journalist. He said because Seaton had been working this case for 5 years and had information about the community context of the disappearance that the investigation did not have and that the investigation needed, and because the exchange of information between investigators and journalists who were operating with the appropriate professional boundaries was not a liability to an investigation, but an asset when it was managed correctly. Vance said she understood. He called Seaton. She answered on the first ring. He said he had a name, and that the name had a history, and that the history was going to require her to think about the Holt case in a context considerably larger than the Holt case alone. He said this with the careful directness of someone who was delivering information that was going to reorganize a journalist's understanding of a story they had been working for 5 years and who wanted the delivery to be complete rather than partial so that the reorganization happened once rather than in stages. She said she was listening. He told her about Garth Weldon and the Lubbock arrest and the victim's name and the missing persons report and the voluntary disappearance classification and the connection to the construction trades and the underground space. She was quiet for the length of time that a significant amount of new information required before it could be responded to with anything other than the noise of the mind processing it. Then she said the voluntary disappearance classification was wrong. He said yes. He said the classification was wrong, and the case was going to be reopened, and the investigation was now operating at a scope that extended beyond Sylvie and Jasper Holt, and that he wanted her to understand that scope before the public statement that the department was preparing for the following morning brought it into public awareness. She asked how much larger the scope was. He said he did not yet know the full dimensions of it, but that the underground space with its domestic provision and its construction quality and the name behind the name and the prior victim and the construction trades background of the person whose name was on a Craig County property deed suggested a scope that the investigation was going to have to establish carefully and completely before anyone could say with confidence how large it actually was. She said she would be in Oklahoma City by morning. He said that would be useful. He ended the call and looked at the 2 names in his notebook, Garth Weldon and Harlan Creed, and below them the address on the rural route in the Texas Panhandle, where the earlier name had lived before the modification, and below that, the construction trades employment history spanning 15 years across the Texas Panhandle and southwestern Oklahoma, and below that, the Craig County parcel and the slab and the room and the shelf and the child's game. He drew a line beneath it all and wrote a single word below the line. The word was who. Then below that, he wrote a second word, and it was the word else. The retired deputy Russ Moyer was 63 years old and lived on a small ranch property outside Lubbock, where he had been raising cattle with the focused and unhurried attention of a man who had spent 26 years in law enforcement and who had found in the daily physical work of agricultural life a quality of straightforward accountability that the work of law enforcement had not always provided. The cattle did what cattle did, and the land did what the land did, and the relationship between a rancher and his property was organized around observable causes and observable effects in a way that a career spent investigating human behavior was not, and Moyer had come to appreciate the difference in the years since retirement with the particular clarity of someone who understood what they had left by experiencing what they had moved toward. Sergeant Vance reached him by phone on Friday afternoon, and he agreed to speak without hesitation. The hesitation-free agreement of a man who recognized immediately the weight of what was being asked and who had the professional memory of a 26-year career sufficient to understand that the question about the '97 arrest was not a routine inquiry. He said he would be available at the ranch the following morning and that he would appreciate someone coming in person rather than continuing by phone, because the matter, as he understood it from Vance's brief description of the context, was a matter that deserved the kind of conversation that happened face-to-face rather than the kind that happened across a cellular connection. Vance drove to Lubbock on Saturday morning, 4 hours from Craig County, on the route that took her across the Oklahoma Panhandle and into the Texas Plains, the landscape becoming progressively flatter and more open as she moved west, the Oklahoma red dirt giving way to the pale caliche of the Texas Panhandle, and the sky expanding in the way that skies expanded when the land beneath them stopped competing with them for vertical attention. She arrived at Moyer's ranch at 10 in the morning and found him waiting on the porch of a low-slung ranch house in the practical clothing of a man who had been working before she arrived and who had come to the porch specifically to receive her without making the receiving of her into more of a production than it needed to be. He poured coffee in the kitchen and led her to a table by a window that looked out at a pasture where a small number of cattle moved in the slow and purposeful way of cattle in good grass, and he sat across from her and folded his hands and said he remembered the Weldon arrest as clearly as he remembered anything from the 26 years, and that some things a person remembered with that clarity were things they were glad they had not forgotten, and some were things they wished they had. The Weldon arrest was in the second category. He said he had responded to a call in October of 1997 from a woman named Louise Bray, who lived on a rural root property in Lubbock County, and who had reported that her neighbor, a man named Garth Weldon, who occupied the adjacent rural root parcel, had entered her property without permission on multiple occasions, and had, on the most recent occasion, confined her in her own barn for a period she estimated at 4 hours by the method of padlocking the barn door from the outside while she was inside tending her animals. She had been released when her brother had arrived for a visit and had found the barn locked and had broken the padlock hasp with a tire iron and had found Louise inside, unharmed physically but profoundly shaken in the way that 4 hours of involuntary confinement in a locked structure produced in a person. A shaking that Moyer said he had seen in the quality of her voice and her hands when he arrived, and that he had recognized as the particular distress of someone who had been enclosed against their will and who was still partially in the enclosure even after the physical fact of it had ended. He had arrested Garth Weldon at the adjacent property that evening. Weldon had been cooperative in a way that Moyer described as studiedly cooperative, the cooperation of a person who had decided that cooperation was the correct response to the situation rather than the natural cooperation of someone who did not understand what the situation was or who had nothing to hide. He had said the padlocking had been an accident, that he had not known Louise was in the barn, that he had been securing the property against coyotes that had been troubling the area and had padlocked the wrong door in the dark without checking whether anyone was inside. He had expressed appropriate concern and appropriate apology in the flat and measured register of someone delivering an apology that had been constructed to be sufficient rather than felt. Moyer had not believed the accident explanation. He had believed it was the correct legal proceeding of an incident that had a straightforward account and a straightforward mechanism, and that the mechanism was intentional rather than accidental in the way that the account described. But the gap between what he believed and what he could establish with the evidence available to him at the point of the arrest had been a gap that the legal process had navigated toward the reduced charge and the suspended sentence, and the gap had not been closed by the investigation that followed, because the investigation that followed had been organized around the available evidence rather than around the investigating officer's understanding of what the available evidence did not yet contain, but might eventually. He paused in his account and looked out at the pasture for a moment. Then he said he had gone back to Louise Bray 2 weeks after the arrest and had asked her, outside the formal structure of the investigation, whether there was anything else she wanted to tell him about Weldon and about the occasions on which he had been on her property. He said he had asked this because 20 years of being a deputy had given him the instinct for the things that people did not say in formal interviews, because the formal structure did not create the conditions for saying them, and that sometimes a less formal conversation created those conditions. Louise had told him, in the less formal conversation, that she had found something on her property in the weeks before the barn incident that she had not reported because she had not understood what it was at the time and had only come to understand it after the barn incident had given her a frame for understanding it differently. She had found, at the edge of her property where it backed onto the scrubland that separated her parcel from Weldon's, an area of disturbed ground approximately the size of a room, 8 feet by 10 or thereabouts, with fresh concrete visible at the edges where the scrub vegetation had not yet grown back over the disturbed soil, and a PVC pipe of the kind used for drainage or ventilation emerging from the concrete at a height of approximately 3 inches above the ground. She had assumed it was a drainage feature of some kind connected to Weldon's property management of the shared boundary area. She had noted it and had not examined it further, and had not mentioned it until the barn incident had provided the frame for understanding that a drainage feature explanation was not the only available explanation for a concrete-covered underground space with a ventilation pipe on a property boundary between her land and Garth Weldon's. Moyer had gone to the boundary area after the conversation with Louise and had found the disturbed ground and the concrete and the ventilation pipe. He had stood at the edge of the feature for a long time, he said, in the October scrubland of the Texas Panhandle, with the wind coming across the flat land in the particular horizontal way it came across the Texas Panhandle, and the feature in the ground before him communicating something that he had not been able to formalize into the language of an investigative finding, but that his body had received with the full weight of a communication that required no language. He had submitted a report to his department recommending a warrant to inspect the feature on the Weldon property side of the boundary. The report had been reviewed by his supervising lieutenant and had been returned with a notation that the arrest had produced a resolved charge and a suspended sentence, and that absent new evidence of criminal activity, a warrant application for an inspection of a property drainage feature was unlikely to be granted by the available judges, and that the department's resource at the current caseload did not support the pursuit of a speculative application. He had accepted the notation. He had continued to think about the feature for 26 years. He looked at Vance across the kitchen table and said he wanted to know whether what was in Craig County was the same kind of feature as what he had found at the Weldon property boundary in Lubbock County in 1997. He said he wanted to know because the answer to that question would tell him whether what he had failed to pursue in 97 had consequences that he needed to understand fully and carry accordingly. Vance said yes. She said the feature in Craig County was the same kind of feature, and that the investigation was still establishing the full scope of what that meant, but that she could tell him, at the point the investigation had currently reached, that the Holt case from 2008 and the Louise Bray unlawful restraint from 97 and the Lubbock County voluntary disappearance misclassification from 2000 were all part of the same account, and that the account extended further in both directions than the Craig County discovery alone had initially suggested. Moyer was quiet for a long time. He looked at his hands on the table, the weathered and capable hands of a man who had worked with them across 2 different careers and who was holding in those hands, at this moment, the weight of a report returned with a notation and a speculative application that had not been pursued, and the 26 years of thinking about a ventilation pipe 3 inches above the ground in the October scrubland of the Texas Panhandle. He said he would provide everything he had. He said he would write a full account of the Louise Bray incident and the boundary feature and the report and the notation and every detail he had retained across the years, and he would have it to Vance by Monday, and she could do with it what the investigation required. Vance thanked him and drove back toward Craig County in the early afternoon. She called Lusk from the car and reported the conversation, the boundary feature on the Lubbock County property, and the report returned with a notation and the 26-year gap between a ventilation pipe in Texas in 1997 and a ventilation pipe in Oklahoma in 2024. Lusk was quiet for a moment. Then he said the gap was not a gap in the sense of an absence. It was a gap in the sense of a period across which the same activity had been occurring in a geography that the investigation had not yet fully mapped. He said the facial recognition and the Garth Weldon name and the construction trades history, and now the Lubbock boundary feature together established a timeline that began before 97 and that the investigation needed to work backward through as well as forward from, because the backward direction was where the full dimensions of the account were going to be found. He said Mara Seaton was in Oklahoma City. He said he was meeting with her in the morning. He said the journalism and the investigation were going to need to move in the same general direction for the next period, and that the management of that parallel movement was something he was going to need to think carefully about. Vance said she understood, and that she would be back in Craig County by evening. She drove east through the Texas Panhandle and back into Oklahoma as the afternoon went toward evening, and the sky over the flat land went through the sequence of colors it went through in that geography at the end of a clear day. The particular oranges and reds of a plain sunset that had no obstruction between them and the horizon, and that therefore occupied the full width of the visible sky in the way of something that had been given all the room it needed and was using every bit of it. She thought about Louise Bray in a locked barn for 4 hours in October of 1997. She thought about a woman named Sylvie Holt who had made a drive 4 times before the 5th time, and who had known every mile of it, and who had stopped for cherry pie in Amberley because her son liked the pie. She thought about a room 8 feet by 10 with a shelf and a child's game and a padlock bracket on the outside of the door and a ventilation pipe 3 inches above the ground in the Oklahoma scrubland that had been waiting since 2006 for what the highway would provide. She thought about the word else in Lusk's notebook that she had not seen, but that he had described to her in the phone call from Oklahoma City, and that she had written in her own notebook, and that she was still thinking about as the Oklahoma plane received the last of the evening light, and the road stretched east ahead of her toward Craig County, and the concrete slab with its open hatch, and the room below it, with its shelf and its empty water bottles, and its corroded batteries, and its full and terrible domestic provision, waiting 16 years for the investigation that had finally arrived. Mara Seaton met Doran Lusk at the State Bureau's Oklahoma City offices on a Sunday morning in April. The building quiet in the way of institutional buildings on weekend mornings, when the administrative infrastructure that normally populated them had reduced to the essential working capacity of an active investigation. He led her to a conference room and poured coffee and set a folder on the table between them and said he was going to share with her the information that the investigation had developed to the point where withholding it from a journalist who had been working the case independently for 5 years was less useful to the investigation than providing it, and that the terms of the sharing were the terms she had worked under before with other investigators, and that he had verified with her editor, and that he expected would be honored. She said they would be honored. He opened the folder. The folder contained a timeline that the Bureau's background investigation unit had assembled across the 72 hours since Lusk had received the facial recognition results and the Garth Weldon name, and had submitted a comprehensive historical trace request covering both names and every record that could be associated with either. The unit's work had produced a document of 31 pages whose density reflected the volume of information recovered and the effort required to organize it into the chronological sequence that made its meaning visible. The earliest entry in the timeline was from 1983, the year that the Social Security employment record showed Garth Weldon beginning work in the construction trades in Lubbock County, Texas, at the age of 22. The employment record covered 6 different construction companies across 15 years, the pattern of employment consistent with the trajectory of a skilled tradesman who moved between companies with the regularity of someone whose skills were in demand and who exercised the option of movement that demand permitted. The skills documented across the employment record included framing, drywall, concrete work, and finish carpentry. the specific combination of construction trade skills that the underground space in Craig County required, and that the Lubbock County boundary feature had required, and that Moyer's description of the barn padlocking and the 4-hour confinement suggested the perpetrator had been developing across a period that predated the first formal incident on the record. The background unit had found, in the period from 1983 through 1997, 3 entries in the records of different Texas counties that the unit had identified as potentially relevant to the investigation's backward direction. Each was an incident report rather than an arrest record, the documentation of a complaint that had been investigated and had not produced a charge, the lowest tier of the formal record that the legal system generated around incidents that were concerning enough to document and insufficient in their evidence to prosecute. Each incident report involved a woman who had reported an encounter with a man matching Weldon's description that she had found alarming, the specific quality of alarm varying across the 3 reports but consistent in its underlying character. The alarm of a person who had been approached in a way that communicated an intention that the approach itself had not made formally actionable. The background unit had cross-referenced the 3 incident reports against the missing persons database for the relevant counties and the relevant time periods. 2 of the 3 incident reports were not connected to any subsequent missing persons report. The third was connected to a missing persons report filed in Cochran County, Texas, in 1991. A woman named Adele Garner, who had been reported missing by her employer after failing to appear for work for 5 consecutive days. The report had been classified as a voluntary departure after a 2-week investigation that had produced no physical evidence of what had happened to her. The voluntary departure classification had remained in place for 33 years. Mara looked at the Adele Garner entry in the timeline for a long time. She looked at the date, 1991, and looked at the incident report cross-reference, and she looked at the voluntary departure classification that had been in place for 33 years, and she thought about the voluntary disappearance misclassification on the Lubbock County case from 2000 and the way in which both classifications had been produced by the same investigative gap, the gap between an incident that looked like a voluntary departure and an investigation that did not have the additional information that would have made the voluntary departure explanation untenable. She asked Lusk how many entries in the timeline were classified as voluntary departures. He said 3. He said the 3 voluntary departure classifications and the unlawful restraint from 97 and the property purchase in Craig County and the construction trades background together constituted a timeline that the investigation was treating as a framework for a pattern of activity spanning at minimum 33 years and potentially longer, with the 1983 employment record entry as the earliest documentation of the person and the 2024 Craig County discovery as the most recent. She asked about the geographic range of the timeline. He said the timeline's geographic entries were distributed across the Texas Panhandle and southwestern Oklahoma in the period from 83 through 2001, which corresponded to the Garth Weldon identity period, and were concentrated in Craig County and the immediately surrounding area of northeastern Oklahoma from 2002 onward, which corresponded to the Harlan Creed identity period and the Craig County property purchase in 2006. The concentration in northeastern Oklahoma from 2002 onward was important for the backward direction of the investigation because it was more geographically constrained than the earlier period and therefore more susceptible to the systematic search that the investigation was now planning. Lusk had requested ground-penetrating radar surveys of the Craig County rural route area north of the highway, extending from the confirmed site outward in the directions that the site's position relative to the county road network suggested as practical access routes for a person moving construction materials to a remote location over an extended building period. The radar survey request had been submitted to the Bureau's survey unit on Saturday and was scheduled to begin on Monday, weather permitting, with a team of 4 specialists and 2 radar units capable of covering the relevant area over a period of 3 to 5 days depending on the terrain and the depth range required. Lusk said he was telling her about the radar survey because the survey was going to be visible from the county road and was going to generate the kind of local attention that county road-level law enforcement activity generated in rural communities. Attention that would produce questions that the department's public information office would need to answer in some form, and that the form of those answers would be informed by what the survey produced. He was telling her now, so that the context of the survey was available to her journalism before the survey became visible rather than after, because before was more useful than after for the quality of coverage that an investigation of this scope deserved. She thanked him and asked him about the Holt case specifically, whether the forensic analysis of the underground space had produced any findings relevant to Sylvie and Jasper's presence in it. He said the biological analysis had confirmed human presence consistent with extended occupancy by two individuals, the biological markers distinguishable by the characteristics that forensic analysis used to distinguish between individuals' biological material, and that the presence markers were consistent with a duration of occupation measured in weeks rather than days. He said the formal duration estimate from the laboratory was 4 to 8 weeks, which bracketed a period beginning approximately the 22nd of August, 2008, and extending through mid-October of the same year, at which point the biological markers indicated the cessation of active occupation, mid-October. Mara wrote it in her notebook and sat with it for a moment. The specific and terrible arithmetic of the biological markers producing a duration that the forensic science could establish, and that the human meaning of the duration required a different kind of reckoning than forensic science provided. She asked what the investigation understood about what had happened after mid-October. Lusk was quiet for a moment. He said the investigation was pursuing several lines of inquiry relevant to that question, and that he was not in a position to discuss the specific directions of those lines at the current stage of the investigation. He said this with the careful professional boundary of an investigator who had shared substantially more than the standard public information framework permitted, and who was at the point where the sharing needed to stop at the edge of what the active investigation required to be held back. She accepted this. She had been working alongside investigations for long enough to know where the edges were and to respect them, not as a constraint on her journalism, but as a feature of the relationship between journalism and investigation that made both more functional rather than less. She closed her notebook and looked at the timeline on the table between them and thought about the backward direction that the investigation was moving in and about the 3 voluntary departure classifications and the incident report cross-references and the construction trades employment history spanning 15 years. And the specific and patient expertise applied to the building of a room for 2 people in the Oklahoma scrubland, and the child's game with its corroded batteries on the second shelf from the top. She thought about what it meant to follow the backward direction as far as it went, and about whether the following of it would produce the full account of what the timeline contained, or whether the timeline, like all timelines that extended far enough into the past, would eventually encounter the limit of the documentary record and stop at a point before the beginning rather than at the beginning itself. She thought about Sylvie Holt and the familiar drive and the cherry pie and the curve in the highway and the 4 to 8 weeks and mid-October and what came after mid-October in the Oklahoma scrubland north of State Highway 54 with the radar survey starting on Monday and the ground-penetrating technology moving across the red dirt landscape in the patient systematic pattern of something that was looking for what the land contained and that had been specifically built to find it. She drove back to her motel and opened her notebook and began writing, not the article that the story would eventually require, but the internal document she produced at the beginning of every significant development in a long investigation. The document that organized what she knew and what she did not yet know, and what she suspected, and what the distance between those 3 categories told her about the shape of what she was following. The document was 7 pages by the time she stopped writing. The last line of the 7th page said, "The backward direction is longer than the forward direction, and what it contains is larger than what the Craig County discovery alone has revealed, and the full shape of it is going to require the complete account of a timeline that may extend further than the investigation has yet been able to establish." She read the last line twice, and then she turned to a new page and wrote the date at the top and below it the names. Sylvie Holt, Jasper Holt, Adele Garner, the Lubbock woman, Louise Bray, who had been in a locked barn for 4 hours in October of '97 and who had found a ventilation pipe at the edge of her property and had assumed it was a drainage feature. She wrote the names, and then she wrote below them, in the careful hand of someone who understood that the writing of a name was the most fundamental act of acknowledgement available to a journalist, and that the names deserved the acknowledgement before anything else. These are the names the investigation has so far. There are more names. The backward direction contains them. The investigation will find them. She closed the notebook and looked at the motel room ceiling and thought about Monday and the radar survey and the red dirt scrubland of Craig County and what the ground-penetrating technology would find when it moved across the land north of the highway in the patient, systematic pattern of something that was specifically built to see what the surface could not show. The ground-penetrating radar survey of the Craig County rural route area began on Monday morning at 7:30. The 2 survey units deployed in the systematic grid pattern that the Bureau's survey team lead. A specialist named Owen Chalk, who had been conducting subsurface surveys for the State Bureau for 12 years, had designed based on the topographic data of the area and the specific characteristics of Oklahoma red clay subsoil and its interaction with the radar frequency range that the equipment operated at. The grid extended from the confirmed site at the northern boundary and moved outward in concentric rectangles covering the accessible sections of scrubland between the county road and the tree breaks that marked the intermittent creek drainages running through the area. A geography of open red dirt and sparse scrub cedar and native grass that offered the survey equipment reliable surface traction, and the subsurface geology of dense clay that the equipment penetrated with the resolution sufficient to identify anomalies at depths up to 12 feet. Lusk was at the survey site from the beginning, positioned at the monitoring station that Chalk had established at the edge of the cleared area where the concrete slab had been opened, watching the real-time data feed from both radar units on a paired monitor setup that showed the subsurface profile of the scanned area as a continuous scrolling image, the density variations of the red clay geology appearing in the false color display as gradations from the dark background of undisturbed soil to the lighter indicators of material with different density characteristics. He had been looking at subsurface radar data for 7 years and had developed the capacity to read the display with the fluency of someone who had learned a visual language through sustained exposure, the ability to distinguish between the density signatures of natural subsurface features, root systems and drainage channels and rock formations, and the signatures of introduced materials, concrete and timber, and the disturbed soil profiles of excavated and backfilled spaces. Chalk's team had covered 30% of the designated grid area by mid-morning and had produced 2 preliminary anomaly flags, areas where the subsurface data showed density profiles inconsistent with undisturbed geology and worth returning to for the more detailed single-point scanning that a flagged area required before any ground-level investigation was initiated. Both preliminary flags were in the section of the grid northeast of the confirmed site, in the area between the site and the drainage tree, break a quarter-mile away. The first flag resolved on detailed single-point scanning as a natural feature. The dense root mass of a cedar stand, whose root system had created a subsurface density profile that the initial scan had misread as a potential introduced element. This was the expected false positive rate for the early stages of a survey in scrubland terrain, and Chalk noted it without concern as a calibration point for the remaining grid work. The second flag did not resolve as a natural feature. Chalk called Lusk to the monitoring station at 11:40 in the morning and pointed at the detailed scan data for the second flag location without speaking, letting the data communicate what it communicated before adding language to it. The scan showed a rectangular subsurface profile at a depth of approximately 5 feet, dimensions consistent with the confirmed site's underground space, with the density signatures of concrete and timber framing visible as the equipment's resolution allowed, and the specific signature of a ventilation pipe running vertically from the rectangular feature to within 3 inches of the surface, the 3-inch termination being the same design specification as the confirmed site's pipe, chosen for the same reason: the minimum height above ground sufficient for air exchange, and the minimum height detectable from the surface at normal observation distance. Lusk looked at the scan data for the length of time it required. Then he said to Chalk to flag the location and move the grid forward without stopping and to complete as much of the remaining survey area as the day permitted before the light failed. He called Vance and told her the survey had produced a second site. He said it without elaboration because the elaboration was implicit in what he had said, and because Vance had the investigative experience to receive it without elaboration and to understand what the second site meant for the investigation's scale. She said she was coming to the survey site. He said there was no need for her to come today. He said the site would not be accessed until the survey was complete, and the access would be coordinated. He said she should use the day to continue the work on the Garth Weldon background with the Lubbock County contacts and to coordinate with the Bureau's Missing Persons Archive Unit on the expanded search parameters he had submitted that morning, which extended the geographic range of the voluntary departure misclassification search to cover the full timeline of the Garth Weldon employment record's geographic scope. She said she understood. He spent the rest of the Monday monitoring the survey from the field station, the real-time data accumulating through the afternoon in the continuous scrolling display that showed the subsurface geology of the Craig County scrubland as a visual record of what the ground contained, the undisturbed clay returning to the dark background of the display after the second flag location and remaining dark through the midday grid sections and into the afternoon sections with the consistency of ground that had not been excavated and filled and covered with concrete and grown over with scrub vegetation. At 3:15 in the afternoon, the display flagged again. Chalk marked it and kept the survey moving, and the detailed single-point scan conducted 20 minutes later showed the same subsurface profile as the second flag, the rectangular feature at depth and the ventilation pipe at 3 inches above the surface, the same construction applied in the same configuration in a different location within the survey grid, 230 yards east of the second flag and 310 yards northeast of the confirmed site. 3 sites, 3 rectangular subsurface features with ventilation pipes. 3 underground spaces built with the same construction methodology by the same person who had applied the same skilled and patient expertise to each of them, and who had covered each with a concrete slab and grown vegetation over the concrete and left the ventilation pipe at the minimum viable height, and had moved between them across the county road network with the knowledge of the local geography that had made the movements invisible to the investigation that had been looking 16 years earlier at the surface of the same land and finding nothing. Lusk called the Bureau Director's office at 3:30 and requested immediate expansion of the investigative resource to the Craig County case. He said the survey had produced 2 additional sites within the survey grid and that the grid was not yet complete, and that the investigation was operating at a scale that exceeded the current resource allocation, and that the expansion was needed before the week was out rather than after. The director authorized the expansion within the hour and said he would be in Craig County himself by Wednesday. Mara Seaton was at the county road perimeter watching the survey equipment move through the scrubland when Chalk's team came off the grid at 5 in the evening. The day's survey concluded and the equipment secured for the overnight. She had been at the perimeter since mid-morning, not attempting to access the site or to speak to anyone on the survey team, but present in the way that a journalist who understood the value of sustained physical presence at a site was present, observing what could be observed from a responsible distance and allowing the physical fact of the landscape and the work being done within it to accumulate in her understanding alongside the documentary evidence that Lusk had provided in the conference room on Sunday. She had watched the survey equipment move, and she had watched Chalk go to the monitoring station twice in mid-morning and once in mid-afternoon with the particular purposeful quality of movement that communicated something had been found requiring his attention, and she had written the times of those visits in her notebook and had understood from the pattern of them and from the geography of the survey grid and from the investigative logic that 5 years of following this case had built in her that the survey was not producing nothing. She called Lusk at 5:30 from the perimeter as the survey team was loading the equipment into their vehicles. He answered and said he could tell her that the survey had produced findings consistent with additional sites requiring investigation and that the investigation was expanding its resource allocation accordingly and that a formal statement would be issued by the Bureau's Public Information Office on Tuesday morning. She asked how many additional sites. He said he was not in a position to provide specific numbers at this stage. She said she understood and that she would wait for the Tuesday statement. She said this with the professional composure of a journalist who had learned that the management of what she was told and when was part of the relationship with an investigator that made the relationship productive over time, and that pressing for specificity at points where the investigation had determined specificity should wait produced a short-term gain and a long-term cost that was not worth the exchange. He said he appreciated her understanding. She drove back to Amberley and parked in the diner lot and went inside and sat at the counter and ordered coffee and cherry pie, because it was the right thing to order in that particular diner on that particular evening when the investigation had moved in the direction that Monday's survey had moved it, and when she needed to sit for a while with the specificity of the Holt case before she allowed her thinking to expand to the full scale of what the expanding investigation contained. The cherry pie arrived on a white plate, and she ate it slowly and thought about Sylvie Holt making this drive 4 times before the 5th time and knowing every mile of it, and knowing the diner because Jasper liked the pie. She thought about the familiarity of the route as a form of comfort and about how the familiarity of a route could become the mechanism of a vulnerability if someone who was watching knew the route as well as the person who traveled it and used that knowledge with the patience of someone who had been building the infrastructure for the using of it 2 years before the particular traveler who would be placed in it had been identified. She thought about the pre-knowledge of the target that Lusk had underlined in the preliminary report's margins. The child's game on the shelf, a game for children aged 8 to 12. Jasper had been 11. The game had been on the shelf before Jasper was in the room, which meant someone had known a child of approximately that age was coming, which meant the selection of Sylvie and Jasper had not been random in the way that the highway and the parking lot and the opportunity of the moment suggested had not been the opportunistic taking of a randomly encountered pair, but had been the deliberate selection of a specific pair who had been observed across a sufficient number of encounters to provide the observer with the knowledge that a woman and a child of a specific age made this particular drive on a recurring schedule, and that the drive passed through the county road geography that the observer knew with the intimate familiarity of the land he had been working in for 2 years. She thought about the 4 prior trips and the diner and Bev Coulter who had known their order before they sat down, and she thought about a man at the far end of the counter on August 22nd who had watched them walk to the door and had paid his bill 4 minutes later and had been reading a newspaper in the way of a counter regular and who had been at that counter. She now thought, not for the first time on the day they disappeared, but for the 3rd or 4th or 5th time, the accumulated visits of a person who had been confirming what he had already established before he acted on what he had established. She finished the pie and paid the bill and walked to her car and stood in the parking lot for a moment, looking at the section of highway visible from the lot and the curve a 1/4 mile west where Dale Pickard had watched the white Malibu disappear. The sky above the Oklahoma scrubland was doing what Oklahoma skies did in April, evenings after clear days, the color going out of it in the long, slow way of a sky with no obstruction between the color and the horizon. The transition from the day's particular blue through the sequence of the plain sunset to the darkness that came after, patient and complete and entirely indifferent to the weight of what was being understood beneath it. She drove west on Highway 54 for 12 miles and turned onto the county road and drove south until she could see the perimeter markers at the edge of the survey site, the orange flagging tape and the bureau vehicles and the equipment cases in the last of the evening light. She parked on the road verge and looked at the survey site from the car for a few minutes, the concrete slab with its open hatch visible at the northern end of the cleared area and the survey grid markers extending south and east into the scrubland beyond it. The flags of the day's anomaly locations visible as orange points in the gathering dark. She counted the flags from the road. She could see 3 orange points in the scrubland beyond the confirmed site. She wrote the number 3 in her notebook and looked at it for a long time. Then she started the car and drove east toward Amberley as the Oklahoma plain went fully dark around her and the highway ran straight and lit only by her headlights through the flat red dirt country that had been keeping what it had been given since the years before the survey and the investigation and the developer's foreman, and the hatch opened and the light went down into the room that had been waiting 16 years for someone to bring light to it. The full survey of the designated grid area was completed on Wednesday, the bureau director present as he had said he would be, and the expanded investigative resource deployed across the Craig County operation in the configuration that the survey's findings had required. The survey produced, across its 3-day completion, 5 anomaly locations whose detailed single-point scanning confirmed the subsurface profile of an underground space with a ventilation pipe at 3 inches above the surface. 5 confirmed sites in addition to the original discovery, making 6 total within the survey grid's coverage area, all sharing the same construction methodology and the same spatial orientation relative to the county road access routes, and all located within a geographic range consistent with a single person moving between them, using the county road network with the knowledge of someone who had been navigating it across an extended period. The 6 sites were accessed sequentially over the following week, the forensic team working each in the order of their discovery, and the access process at each site following the same careful protocol that the confirmed site had established. The hatch opened, and the portable lighting deployed, and the descent conducted by the forensic team lead before any wider access was permitted. Each site produced a space consistent in its construction with the confirmed site, the drywall and the timber framing and the vapor barrier floor and the built-in shelf unit against the eastern wall and the padlock bracket on the outside of the door. Each space had its shelf contents in the condition of things that had been in an enclosed underground space for periods ranging from several years to over 2 decades, the degradation of materials following the timeline of the space's last active occupancy in the way that enclosed spaces preserved their contents along the curve of their own specific temperature and humidity profile. Each site produced the biological markers of human presence. Each site's forensic analysis produced findings consistent with extended occupancy by individuals whose biological material was distinguishable and whose presence markers allowed the laboratory to establish duration estimates with the qualified precision of forensic science applied to material at the edge of its detectable range. The 5 additional sites and the confirmed site together established a timeline of activity in Craig County that Lusk and Vance and the expanded investigative team worked through across the 2 weeks following the survey's completion. The timeline assembled from the forensic data and the property records and the construction materials sourcing investigation that the Bureau's Financial Forensics Unit had been conducting in parallel with the ground survey, tracing the purchase of drywall and timber and concrete and PVC pipe and the specific hardware of the shelf units and the door mechanisms through the records of building supply companies in the Craig County area and the adjacent counties. The purchases spread across multiple suppliers over multiple years in the pattern of someone who had understood that concentrated purchasing would generate a detectable record and who had distributed the purchasing across sufficient time and sufficient suppliers to prevent the pattern from being visible to a standard supply chain review. The distribution pattern was visible to the Financial Forensics Unit's methodology, which was specifically designed to find patterns across distributed records that standard reviews did not aggregate. The purchases, when assembled into their full sequence, covered a period from 2002 through 2015. 13 years of intermittent materials acquisition consistent with the construction and supply of 6 underground spaces of the confirmed dimensions. The purchasing timeline providing the most precise available documentation of when each space had been built and therefore the earliest possible date of each space's active use. The earliest site, the site with the oldest construction materials and the longest duration estimate from the biological analysis, had been built in 2002, the year the Harlan Creed identity was established in Oklahoma, and the year after the Garth Weldon records in Texas had ended. The most recently built site had been constructed in 2015, which placed its construction 7 years before the Craig County discovery and 9 years after the Jasper property purchase that had provided the 2006 materials sourcing peak in the financial forensics timeline. The Holt case was associated with the confirmed site and with the materials purchasing cluster of 2005 and 2006, the cluster that corresponded to the construction of the space that had been supplied specifically for 2 people for the duration that the biological markers established. The remaining 5 sites were associated with other purchasing clusters across the 13-year timeline, each cluster corresponding to a specific site's construction and each site's biological analysis, producing evidence of occupancy that the investigation was working to connect to specific individuals through the missing persons database cross-reference and the DNA analysis that the State Bureau's laboratory was conducting on the biological material recovered from each space. The DNA analysis required time. It required the extraction and processing of biological material from surfaces that had been in contact with human presence across periods of several years in an enclosed underground environment, material degraded by time and the specific chemistry of the Oklahoma clay subsoil's moisture and mineral content, and the processing of that material against the National DNA Database and against the reference samples provided by the families of missing persons whose cases the investigation had identified as potentially relevant through the backward direction work that Vance had been coordinating with the Bureau's Missing Persons Archive Unit. The reference samples came from families who had been waiting for something to match against. Families who had organized their lives around a voluntary departure classification or a maritime presumption or a cold case file that nobody had opened in years, and who had provided, when the investigation contacted them, with the precise and careful communication that Lusk had insisted upon across every family contact, blood samples and hair samples, and the intimate biological generosity of people who understood that what they were providing might be the mechanism by which a question that had been suspended in the unanswered territory of their lives for years or decades was finally moved from that territory into the territory of the formerly known. The trial of Garth Weldon, prosecuted under his legal name of origin, and the full evidentiary record of the Harlan Creed identity modification and the Craig County property purchase and the 6 underground spaces and the forensic findings from each of them, and the biological and DNA evidence and the construction materials purchasing timeline and the missing persons cross-references and the Lubbock County unlawful restraint record and the 3 incident reports from the Texas Panhandle and the voluntary departure misclassifications and the backward direction of a timeline that extended from 2024 back to 1991 at minimum, opened in the Federal District Court in Tulsa in the spring of 2025. It ran for 31 days. Mara attended every session. She sat in the gallery with her notebook across her knees, and she watched a man who was now 63 years old and who had the weathered angular face and the level unrevealing gaze of the driver's license photograph from 2005, and who sat at the defense table with his hands flat on its surface and his attention in the middle distance of a person who had long since moved into an interior space that the exterior proceedings could document but could not access. The prosecution was led by an assistant United States attorney named Constance Okara, who was precise and relentless in the methodical way of a prosecutor who understood that the case's strength was in its accumulation. The weight of 31 days of systematic evidence building one element upon the next until the structure of the account was visible in its full dimensions, requiring no dramatic flourish and no emotional augmentation because the account itself carried all the weight that weight required. She presented the 6 sites in the chronological order of their construction, beginning with the 2002 site and moving forward through the timeline to the confirmed Holt site, each site's evidence presented in its full forensic detail before moving to the next. The accumulation of sites building across the prosecution's first week into a picture of systematic and patient construction applied across 13 years to the same purpose in the same geography by the same person whose construction trades expertise was documented in the employment record and whose identity modifications were documented in the state and federal records and whose connection to each site was established through the materials purchasing trail and the DNA evidence and the property access records. She presented the DNA findings in the prosecution's second week. The laboratory had succeeded in establishing DNA profiles from the biological material recovered from 4 of the 6 sites, the material from the remaining 2 sites having degraded beyond the threshold of the extraction methodology available. Of the 4 sites from which profiles had been established, 3 had been matched against the reference database and against the family samples provided by the contacted families. The matches were formal identifications that the medical examiner and the forensic laboratory had certified with the confidence interval that the evidence and the methodology supported, and that the families of the identified individuals had received in the careful and direct communications that Lusk had insisted upon, and that he had conducted personally wherever the investigation's geographic distribution had made the personal conduct of them possible. Sylvie and Jasper Holt were identified through the confirmed site's biological material. The DNA profiles extracted from the floor and the shelf surfaces and the wall surfaces at the height, consistent with the occupancy of a woman and a child of the relevant ages matching the reference samples provided by Sylvie's mother, Adele, who was now 71 and who had waited 16 years for this specific match and who received it with the particular quality of a person who has been carrying a suspended weight for so long that the weight has become structural rather than acute, part of the architecture of the life rather than a separate burden within it, and who finds that the formal confirmation of what they have known in the formless way of long grief changes the architecture without removing it. Adele Holt had driven from Amarillo to Oklahoma City for the identification meeting and had sat across from Lusk in the conference room, where he had met with Mara Seaton 6 weeks earlier and had received the formal confirmation in the plain and complete way that Lusk had determined was the only appropriate way to deliver it, without softening and without medical or psychological management of the delivery, because Adele had asked specifically for the plain version and had said that 16 years of waiting entitled her to the directness that the situation deserved. She had listened and had said nothing for a long time. Then she had said that Sylvie had known every mile of that drive. She had said this not as a lament, but as a statement of fact, the fact of a daughter who had made a familiar journey and who had carried in the familiarity of it the particular comfort that familiar things carried, and the fact of a woman who wanted that comfort acknowledged alongside everything else the confirmation contained, the last ordinary thing given its proper weight before the formal record of everything after it took precedence. Lusk said yes. He said Sylvie had known every mile of it, and that the knowing of it was part of the record and would remain part of it. Adele nodded. She looked at her hands for a moment, and then she looked at Lusk with the direct and collected expression of a woman who had lived inside an unresolved loss for 16 years, and who had developed across those years the capacity to hold the unresolvable with the full force of her attention without being destroyed by it. The capacity of a grandmother who had kept the porch light on and the front door painted and the photographs of Sylvie and Jasper in the places they had always been in the house outside Amarillo, maintaining the shape of the life that had been interrupted against the day when the interruption would be formally concluded. She said she had a question. She said it was the only question she needed answered beyond what had already been provided. She asked whether Jasper had been with Sylvie across the duration that the forensic evidence established. Lusk said yes. He said the biological profiles from the confirmed site were consistent with 2 individuals present across the full duration of the estimated occupancy period, which was the most specific answer he could provide, and which was the answer that the evidence supported. She absorbed this. Then she said good. She said it with the same quiet conviction that Patricia Casper had said it was good when Pell had confirmed that Noel had been with Adrian. The particular comfort of the togetherness available in the specific circumstances as a form of the only comfort available, and receiving it without apology because it was what there was and it was real. The verdict arrived on the morning of the 31st day. Guilty on all applicable counts. The federal judge delivered the sentencing 3 weeks later in the language of federal sentencing applied with the weight of what 31 days of evidence had established, the full scope of the account, given its full formal consequence in the institutional language of the system that had finally arrived at the capacity to provide it. Weldon received the sentence as he had received everything in the proceedings, with his hands flat on the table and his eyes in the middle distance and his interior occupancy complete and self-contained in the way it had been complete and self-contained across the full length of the 31 days and across the years before the 31 days, the years when the Craig County scrubland had held what it had been given and the ventilation pipes had stood 3 inches above the ground in the red dirt open country, and the Oklahoma plain had kept its silence in the particular way of very large flat geographies that had no interest in the disclosure of what they contained. He was led from the courtroom. He did not look back. The porch light at Adele Holt's house outside Amarillo had been on every night since the 22nd of August, 2008. Adele had replaced the bulb as needed across 16 years, without allowing the light to be off for more than the brief practical interval required between the removal of the old bulb and the installation of the new one. She had not thought of this as ritual when she began it. She had thought of it as the most basic available expression of the position she was maintaining, the light that indicated the house was waiting for someone to arrive, That the door was open in the sense that mattered even when it was closed in the literal sense. That the person who had not yet come was expected and would be received. She turned the light off on the evening of the verdict. She did not do this as a dramatic gesture or as a symbolic statement about closure, a word she had never applied to the experience of Sylvie and Jasper's disappearance and its resolution, because closure implied a door that closed cleanly on what was inside it, and she had found no door of that description available to her in 16 years of looking. She turned it off because the light had been a communication to the people she had been waiting for, and the communication had been received, formally and completely, and with the weight of a federal court's full evidentiary process behind it, and continuing to send a communication whose receipt had been established was not something she found meaningful to continue. She sat on the porch in the dark for a while after turning it off. The Amarillo night around her warm and still in the way of late spring evenings in the Texas Panhandle, and she thought about the drive and the diner and the cherry pie and the curve in the highway and the 16 years and the concrete slab and the ventilation pipe and the formal confirmation and the word good that she had said when Lusk told her about the two biological profiles present across the full duration. She thought about Jasper, who had been 11 years old and who had liked cherry pie. She thought about this specifically, and without trying to think about anything else, the fact of a boy who had liked cherry pie, holding the fact in the simple and irreducible form in which she had always carried it. The fact of a specific person who had been alive and whose aliveness had expressed itself in the particular preference of a specific 11-year-old for the cherry pie at a specific diner on a specific highway in Oklahoma. A preference that had been real and had mattered, and that the formal record of the investigation would never contain, but that she contained and would continue to contain for the remainder of her life. She went inside and left the porch light off. The Craig County scrubland north of State Highway 54 was purchased by the Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation in the autumn of 2025. The acquisition funded through a combination of state conservation budget and a private donation from an anonymous contributor whose attorney communicated to the department's acquisition office that the donor's intention was to ensure that the land was held in the permanent public trust in a form that prevented future private development. The acquisition covered the full parcel that had been in Harlan Creed's name and the adjacent parcels that the ground-penetrating survey had covered, a total of 62 acres of red dirt scrubland that the department designated as a conservation area and closed to the public pending the development of a management plan. The 6 sites were all sealed after the forensic work was complete, the hatches welded shut from the outside and the concrete slabs left in place above them. The vegetation allowed to continue its return over the disturbed ground in the slow and patient way of Oklahoma scrub in red clay soil that had been opened and was now being allowed to close again. The ventilation pipes remained above the surface at their 3-inch height, the only visible indication from the surface of what was below 6 small PVC caps in the scrubland distributed across the conservation area's 62 acres in the pattern that the forensic survey had established, present and visible to anyone who walked the land and knew what they were looking at, and invisible to anyone who did not. Mara Seaton's book was published in the winter of 2025. Its title was the question she had written at the top of a new notebook page in a motel room in Amberley in April, the same night she had eaten cherry pie at the diner counter and thought about a boy who had liked it, and the question she had subsequently answered across 8 months of sustained investigation and journalism and the patient following of a backward direction through a timeline that had extended further than either the investigation or her journalism had initially been prepared to follow. The title was Who Else? The book covered the full timeline from the 1983 employment record through the 2024 discovery, the full geographic range of the Texas Panhandle and the Craig County scrubland and every county and community in between that the investigation had documented as part of the account. It covered the 3 voluntary departure misclassifications and the incident reports and the unlawful restraint, and Louise Bray in the locked barn for 4 hours in October of '97, and the ventilation pipe at the property boundary that Russ Moyer had found and had tried to pursue and had been told was not worth a speculative warrant application. It covered the 6 sites and their forensic findings and the DNA identifications and the families who had received them and the families who were still waiting, because the 2 sites whose biological material had degraded beyond the extraction threshold had not yet produced the profiles that would allow the identification matches to be made. Those 2 families were still waiting when the book was published. Mara addressed this directly in the book's penultimate chapter, which she had written and rewritten more times than any other chapter, because the obligation to the families still waiting was the most important obligation the journalism carried and the most difficult to discharge in a form that honored both the weight of the waiting and the limitation of what the current evidence could provide. She wrote that the investigation was ongoing and that the laboratory methodologies available to the Bureau were continuing to develop, and that the Bureau's commitment to the remaining 2 sites' identification was stated and documented, and that the journalism's commitment to following that process was equally stated and documented, and that neither commitment would be abandoned while there were families for whom the question, who else, remained personal rather than historical. Lusk read the book in a single weekend in January. He was still the lead investigator on the Holt case and on the expanded Craig County investigation, which remained active in the formal sense of an investigation with open evidentiary questions and ongoing laboratory work and 2 identification processes not yet concluded. He had been the lead for 9 months, and he intended to remain the lead until the investigation was complete, in the sense that no remaining question that the evidence could answer had been left unanswered. He called Mara on the Sunday evening after finishing the book. He said she had written it the way it deserved to be written, and that the families he had spoken to who had read it had said the same thing, and that this mattered to him both professionally and personally. She thanked him and asked about the remaining 2 identifications and whether the laboratory had any update on the extraction methodology development. He said there was progress. He said he expected to be able to tell her more within the month. He said he would call her when he could tell her more and that she should plan for a trip to Craig County. She said she would be ready. She drove to Amberley one more time in the winter of 2025, on a Saturday morning when the Oklahoma plain was gray and cold, and the highway carried little traffic in the early hour, and the diner's sign was lit in the dark of the morning, and the parking lot was nearly empty. She parked where she had parked on every visit and went inside and sat at the counter and ordered coffee and cherry pie because it remained the right thing to order there, and because ordering it was the act of acknowledgement that the diner and its specific menu item deserved for the particular and irreducible role it occupied in the account she had spent 8 months following. Greta was on the counter. She poured the coffee without asking and said she had read the book. Mara said she hoped it had done the subject justice. Greta said she thought it had. She said Bev Coulter had read it in the care facility where Bev was living now, her health having declined in the 2 years since her retirement, and that Bev had called Greta after finishing it and had said that it was the first time in 17 years that the man at the far end of the counter had been given his proper place in the account, not as a detail that the investigation had noted and not followed up on, but as the specific and deliberate presence that Bev had always understood him to be. The presence of someone who had already decided and was simply confirming what he had decided before acting on it. Mara said she was glad it had reached Bev. She ate the cherry pie slowly in the quiet of the Saturday morning diner, with the highway visible through the window and the curve a quarter-mile west where the white Malibu had rounded the bend and the red dirt scrubland beyond the curve going to the horizon in the flat and open way it always went. The Oklahoma plain holding its position under the winter sky, patient and permanent and entirely returned to itself. The ventilation pipes 3 inches above the ground in the conservation area's 62 acres, the only remaining surface evidence of what the plain had held and what the investigation had found, and what the journalism had followed, and what the families had waited for, and what the laboratory was still working toward in the 2 sites not yet resolved. The work ongoing in the way of work that was not finished because the finishing of it was owed to people for whom the finishing was not a professional obligation, but a personal one. The most fundamental obligation, available in the territory between what was known and what remained to be known. She finished the pie and left money on the counter and drove west on State Highway 54, and did not stop at the curve, but continued past it. west through the scrubland of Craig County in the January morning, the road straight and open ahead of her, and the conservation area's 62 acres somewhere to the north of the highway beyond the county road junction. The plain above it undisturbed, and the plain below it keeping the last of what it had been asked to keep until the laboratory's ongoing work produced the answer that would release it into the formal record where it belonged, and where the families who were still waiting had been waiting for it across the full patient length of a waiting that the investigation and the journalism had committed to following until the following was done. She drove until the highway crossed the county line and left Craig County behind her. Then she turned around and drove back east, toward Amberley and the diner and the parking lot and the curve and all the distance between where she was and where the story continued, which was everywhere the plain extended, and everywhere the families waited, and everywhere the laboratory worked, and everywhere the investigation remained open, and the journalism remained present, and the account was still being written in the only direction that mattered, which was forward, one careful and documented mile at a time.